Still hunting the scriptures for evidence of fulfilled prophecy as proof that the Bible can be relied upon as true, Bob Dutko, evangelical radio talk show host and apologist, believes the Old Testament book of Isaiah correctly predicted that Jesus would bring his ministry to non-Jews.
It's prophesied in Isaiah 42:1 that he will minister to the Gentiles, which Jesus did.
But did he? Did Jesus really minister to Gentiles? If we actually look at the New Testament and not take an apologist's word for it, we find a markedly different picture than the one he is trying to present. Instead of bringing his message to the Gentiles, we instead find instances of Jesus actually forbidding the presentation of the gospel to them. For example, in a story found in Matthew 10, Jesus calls his disciples, giving them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. He then instructs them to go out and take the message that the kingdom of heaven has come near and to heal the sick and raise the dead. But not just to anyone. Verses 5 and 6 read, "These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel." Not exactly a fulfillment of a prophecy, supposedly forecasting a ministry to the Gentiles. In one of the more disturbing stories found in the Gospels, Matthew and Mark both record an encounter between Jesus and a desperate Gentile woman, a story confirming the idea that Jesus came only for the Jews. Jesus was traveling through Tyre and Sidon, a Gentile region, and a Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." And yet, Jesus did not answer a word. As the woman kept up her appeals, Jesus finally responded, but his words were not those of comfort and ministry to the Gentile. "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel," Matthew records. Both Matthew and Mark report that Jesus then, seemingly irritated at the woman's pleading, equated her, and by extension all Gentiles, with hungry dogs who lurk in the shadows of society hoping for scraps. It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. However, the woman did not give up, and Jesus eventually, and one can even argue grudgingly, granted her request. It's hard to make the case that Jesus actually ministered to this Gentile woman, when he was instead so reluctant to help, and in fact refused to do so initially. In another encounter with a Gentile, Luke 7 records Jesus as responding to a request for the healing of a Roman centurion's servant. However, he doesn't do so out of a ministry directed toward the Gentiles, but is persuaded to perform the miracle because his fellow Jews point out that the centurion is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue. If one has to have one's arms twisted to help, that can hardly be called a ministry. Apologists might point out, however, the closing chapter of Matthew 28. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you." This passage is known as the Great Commission, a command to bring the gospel to the entire world, which, of course, would have included Gentiles. However, the Great Commission comes from the resurrected Christ, not from Jesus as part of his earthly ministry. And it was not Jesus bringing this good news to the Gentiles, but his followers. Additionally, in Acts 15 we read about a controversy disturbing the early church shortly after Jesus' ascension. The story recounts a council of the early church which met to discuss the inclusion of Gentiles in the Jesus movement. Some in the council argued that Gentiles must be circumcised and obey all the laws of Moses. Others, including Peter, thought differently. It is clear from this vignette that the issue was troubling and that no instructions for the inclusion of Gentiles had been left to the disciples by Jesus. They could not follow or appeal to any example Jesus had left during his own earthly ministry. Later inclusions by the evangelists of tales of Jesus ministering to Gentiles, such as the healing of the Roman centurion's servant, were included as allegory and to soften the more severe stance of ministry only to the Jews taken by the historical Jesus. They also served to highlight how the gospel message, once presented to Gentiles, was far more successful with them than it had been with Jews. This is why you read such comments attributed to Jesus as that found in the centurion story. I tell you, I have not found such great faith, even in Israel. These are not historical recollections, but propaganda to sell the Jesus movement. Most biblical scholars accept the historicity of a Jesus mission exclusively to the Jews, not only because the evidence is found in the New Testament, but also because its inclusion is an embarrassment for the later church. Having successfully marketed their product to Gentile converts, to retain such stories as the Canaanite woman in the official propaganda of the movement isn't exactly a smart strategy. Jesus' exclusionary mission to the lost sheep of Israel must have been such a well-known feature of his ministry that it could not have been ignored and left out of the Gospels. Again, this is why you can find stories of Jesus' interaction with Gentiles invented to soften this otherwise abrasive exclusivity, especially as time went on. This is also why a story such as that of the Canaanite woman is missing from John's Gospel, the last of the four Gospels to be included in the New Testament. So even if Isaiah 42:1 was a prophecy about a future Messiah ministering to Gentiles, as the Apologist claims, it wasn't fulfilled by Jesus. All of that aside, however, we should probably actually take a look at Isaiah 42:1, as Dutko merely mentions the verse as one of prophecy having been fulfilled by Jesus. We never hear what the verse actually says. Not surprisingly, we'll quickly find, again, that the Apologist has taken the verse out of context. Isaiah 42:1 reads, quoting words spoken by Yahweh, "Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations." What does that have to do with Jesus, or with ministering to Gentiles? Who is this servant being referenced? Currently, scholars disagree on whether Isaiah 42 verses 1 through 4 even belong with the original surrounding material, or if these verses were an insertion made by a later editor of the text. Nonetheless, the passage is supposed to be an address to the Jews exiled in Babylon. However, scholars note that this collection of writings was actually compiled much later, from the perspective of an editor or editors knowledgeable about the Persian conquest of Babylon and the return of at least some Jewish people to their homeland. Presumably, when these chapters were written, Persia was still largely in control of the region, and thus why we find positive references to them in several verses. In chapter 41, verse 2, for instance, is a probable reference to the Persian king Cyrus, who liberated the Jews and allowed them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Be that as it may, the fact that the servant of 42:1 isn't named is not an open invitation for Christian apologists to assert it must be in reference to Jesus. Prior to the Christian movement, the translators of the Septuagint assumed the servant was Israel itself. Isaiah 42:1 there reads, "Jacob is my servant, I will help him. Israel is my chosen, my soul has accepted him. I have put my spirit upon him, he shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles." Indeed, there is textual reason for accepting the servant as Israel itself. In just the prior chapter, we read in 41:8, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen." So the Septuagint's identification of the servant in 42:1 can be tied to the text itself. It is the Jewish people whom Yahweh upholds, in whom he delights, and upon whom he will place his spirit. In the context of Isaiah, it is the Jewish people who will bring justice to the other nations. Scholars like Walter Brueggemann, in his commentary on Isaiah, also equate the servant with Israel. Brevard Childs from the Divinity School of Yale University has written, "The term servant does not occur for the first time in 42:1, but is introduced in 41:8, along with a variety of familiar attributes. Israel, Jacob, is designated as servant, the elect one, offspring of Abraham, even friend. Then in verse 9, Israel is again named the servant who has not been cast off, and who was promised aid from God's victorious hand. For anyone who takes the larger literary context seriously, there can be no avoiding the obvious implication that, in some way, Israel is the servant who is named in 42:1. Obviously, then, in the proper context of these verses, having returned from exile, the Jewish community in the role of God's servant was to stand as an example to the nations of the world. Through Israel, God would work his justice. This had nothing whatsoever to do with a 1st century AD apocalyptic Jewish holy man bringing the news of universal salvation to Romans and Greeks. It's just yet another example of a Christian apologists disrespecting the Jewish scriptures in favor of their own religious agenda. Funding for this program was provided in part by Cody Seaton and from the generous contributions of other viewers like you via Patreon. Consider joining them at www.patreon.com/Bible Skeptic. Thank you.